3 riders over the rise, moving fast and purposeful. The man in front, broad-shouldered, carrying an expression that suggested he'd forgotten how smiling worked years ago, pulled up his horse and looked directly at them without any pretense of surprise. "Girl, travels with a price on her head," he called out flatly. "Old man's just old." Elias pushed Nora behind an overturned water trough, and the shooting started before the echo of those words had finished moving through the air. Splinters exploded from the boards above their heads. Elias fired once from behind a wagon wheel and watched one rider go sideways off his saddle. A second man came low with a blade. Elias twisted away with barely enough time, stumbled, then brought the barrel of his Colt across the man's jaw with enough force to put him into the dust. But the leader was a different problem entirely. Younger, broader, faster than anything Elias had bargained for. One punch sent the old rancher crashing into the trough beside Nora, hard enough to fracture his vision momentarily. He stayed down, trying to locate enough air to stand again. Nora raised the pearl-handled Remington with both trembling hands and aimed it directly at the man's chest. He stopped, looked at her, then smiled the particular smile that cold iron smiles. "Go ahead then," he said, but Nora couldn't pull the trigger. And watching that, Elias understood her more completely than hours of conversation had accomplished. The man's eyes dropped to the edge of the ledger visible inside her coat, and Elias felt his stomach turn entirely over. He'd miscalculated. The man wasn't chasing Nora. He was chasing that book. More shots cracked from behind the building. A bullet skimmed the top of the trough so close that Nora felt the displaced air move against her hair. The moment shattered. Elias grabbed her arm. "Wagon now!" He hauled himself onto the seat with considerably less dignity than he would have preferred. Everything hurt in ways that had stopped having names. Ribs, shoulder, the basic mechanical act of drawing breath. But he slapped the reins down and pushed the horses forward through the dry Wyoming earth, while behind them the riders spread wide across the flats. He recognized that formation immediately. They weren't angling for a quick finish. They were cutting off every direction of escape. That was the more dangerous approach by a significant margin. The road to Garnet Crossing stretched ahead through open rolling grassland. Nowhere to shelter. No forgiveness in the landscape. No mercy in any direction. Around midday, Nora noticed the dark stain spreading through the shoulder of Elias's shirt. A bullet had found him somewhere in the chaos at the relay station. "You need a doctor," she said. He kept his eyes fixed on the trail. Ahead. Nearest thing to a proper doctor in this territory usually arrives. Smelling like rye whiskey and carrying scissors he last cleaned around. 1871. She laughed despite everything happening around them. They reached Garnet Crossing late in the afternoon. The word town was doing generous work here. A handful of weathered buildings clustered around the rail line, a water tower leaning noticeably eastward, and a telegraph office that looked as though one ambitious windstorm might settle the question of its continued existence. Elias sat motionless on the wagon seat for a long moment before his body agreed to attempt climbing down, a man conducting quiet negotiations with his own legs. Inside, the young telegraph clerk behind the counter looked at the revolver on Elias's hip, then at the blood soaking through his sleeve, and appeared to be calculating whether his wage was intended to cover situations of this particular nature. Nora drew the ledger from inside her coat and held it carefully. Her hands were steady now, but she paused, one full breath, understanding completely what she was releasing. That book was the only thing keeping her father alive. It was also the reason every mile of the past 2 days had been trying to kill them. Elias looked at her quietly. "If you're waiting for life to get fair before you do what needs doing," he said, "you'll be waiting long after it matters." She held his eyes for one breath, then she placed the ledger on the counter. Every name, every date, every figure was transmitted to Federal Marshal Henry Greer in Cheyenne. When the final click of the telegraph key faded into silence, Nora released something she felt like she'd been carrying locked inside her chest since this whole nightmare had begun. But Elias wasn't relaxed, not remotely. Old survival habits meant he noticed small things, and the thing he noticed now was that the telegraph clerk had stopped making direct eye contact entirely. The boy kept glancing toward the window, toward the horses tied outside, toward the road running south. Elias stepped slowly out onto the porch. Far down the trail, a single rider was already dissolving into the dust at full gallop, heading south toward Laramie as fast as that horse could be driven. The old rancher's stomach went through the floorboards entirely. Deputy Cole Briggs now knew everything, and Thomas Dalton was sitting alone in a jail cell with a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Briggs moved before the next dawn touched. Laramie? He pulled Thomas Dalton from his cell with two men flanking, him and a covered wagon waiting silently in the alley behind the jailhouse. No judge, no witnesses who would speak about what they'd seen. Just darkness, silence, and a desperate crooked lawman trying to bury 30 years of sins before morning light could illuminate them properly. But Elias Croft had already worked that much out. By the time Elias, Nora, and Marshal Henry Greer rode back into Laramie, the Wyoming sky had shifted from deep black to the fragile pale gray that comes just before sunrise makes its final commitment. Nora spotted her father first. His wrists were bound. His face carried the particular exhaustion that only real fear produces. But when he looked up and saw his daughter alive, riding toward him through the gray morning light, something fundamental shifted in his posture. Like a man remembering, after a long and terrible absence, exactly who he was. Briggs reached for his revolver at almost the precise moment Marshal Greer called his name across the empty street. Everything that followed lived inside a handful of heartbeats. No speeches. No time for them. Elias stepped in front of Nora anyway. His legs nearly betrayed him before he caught himself against the side of the wagon. 64 years old, bruised through to the marrow, operating on dust and stubbornness and something that defied any reasonable medical explanation. And still, the old rancher moved toward the danger rather than away from it. That tells you everything worth knowing about a man, not how much strength he has remaining, but who he chooses to protect when his body has already cast its vote to quit. Marshal Greer fired first. The shot rang clean and final across the silent street. Briggs's revolver spun out of his grip and clattered into the dirt beside a wagon wheel. The man who had terrorized half of Laramie County stood suddenly revealed as exactly what he'd always been: small, cornered, and finished. The second rider broke for his horse. Greer's men stopped him before he covered 10 steps, and then it was over. Truly over. Elias lowered his old Colt with the slow deliberateness of a man setting something very heavy down for the last time. His breathing came rough and uneven. Nora reached him just as his legs finally surrendered. Completely. He went down in the dust he had fought across an entire, desperate night to reach, and I believe that image is the one that stays with people long after every other detail has faded. Not the gunfight, not the federal marshal, not the ledger full of incriminating names. Just a tired old man who could have remained on his porch and watched someone else's trouble from a comfortable distance and chose instead that a stranger's daughter was worth every single mile of it. A few months after that summer, Cole Briggs was tried and removed from Wyoming territory permanently. Thomas Dalton recovered his land, his water rights, and every shred of his reputation. And Nora Dalton developed what she described as a perfectly practical habit of riding out to Elias Croft's ranch bearing fresh-baked pie, strong black coffee, and no particular urgency to leave before the afternoon had run its full course. There's something worth sitting with in that. The finest things in a life don't always arrive polished and effortless. Sometimes they show up trail-worn and limping, carrying more history than pride, smelling of wood smoke and old leather and hard-won miles, and perhaps that's precisely why they hold. Some mornings after that summer, Elias moved a little slower than the season before, but Nora never appeared to be in any particular hurry. Before we close out tonight, one question. I want to leave with you. If you'd been standing in that dusty Laramie street at sunrise, watching everything come to its end, would you have put your faith in the old rancher with the worn-out eyes or the man wearing the shining badge? Drop your answer below. I read everyone, and if a story about quiet courage and ordinary loyalty sat with you tonight, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll keep finding more tales worth the telling. The Wyoming sun past Laramie didn't just shine. It pressed down like a judgment, flattening the prairie grass and baking the color out of everything it touched. Even the wind had given up by noon, A man named Elias Croft had spent enough seasons on this frontier to recognize the particular smell of danger before it ever showed its face. 64 years old, weathered to the core, he'd helped lower too many good men into the Wyoming earth to confuse trouble with anything less threatening. Mostly he'd been wise enough to step around it, which was probably the single greatest reason his heart was still beating when so many others had gone quiet. All he wanted was a straightforward run into town and back. Cornmeal, tobacco, lantern oil. Home before the stars came out. Instead, movement caught his eye in the tall grass along the wagon trail. A young woman, crawling. His first instinct was heat stroke, maybe whiskey. Then he saw the blood soaking through her stocking. The wound wouldn't kill her, not directly. A bullet had raked across the lower part of her leg without lodging inside, but every inch she dragged herself forward painted fresh agony across her face. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her dress, once pale, now ruined with sweat and trail grit, clung to her as she clawed forward through the dirt. Dark hair fell loose across her face, and in her right hand, shaking badly, she clutched a small pearl-handled Remington pocket pistol. Elias climbed down from the wagon with the careful patience of a man whose joints had developed strong opinions over the decades. The girl's head snapped up. The little gun swung toward him. Her grip was too unsteady to be truly dangerous, but her eyes were steady enough. "Stay back," she managed. He studied her for a moment. That pistol wasn't about aggression. It was about terror, the only language left to a person who'd run out of all the others. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats beyond the ridge. 2 horses, possibly 3, moving with the deliberate purpose of men who weren't out for a casual ride. Elias's eyes swept the landscape and settled on a dry creek bed roughly 40 yards ahead. That was it. That was all they had. If those riders crested that hill and found her lying exposed in open grass, nothing that followed would be negotiable. Move. Right now. His voice carried quiet urgency rather than panic. She tried to push forward and buckled immediately. A sharp cry escaped before she could swallow it back. Tears had carved clean lines through the dust on her face. "I can't," she gasped. Elias glanced back toward the ridge. Too close. No margin left for careful thinking. He dropped down beside her with a grunt that cost him more dignity than he'd have liked and pressed one calloused hand gently against her back. "Keep going," he said. "I'll watch our tail." She pulled herself through the dead grass, pain tearing through her with every movement. The small pistol rattled in her grip. Then she turned and looked back at him. And that expression hit Elias somewhere he hadn't expected. Not panic. Not desperation. It was the face of someone standing right at the edge of becoming a version of themselves they could never walk back from. "Don't let me turn into something I can't undo," she whispered. He recognized it. Completely. The riders cleared the grass line. Elias raised his old Colt and fired once toward a rusted bucket dangling from a broken fence post 30 yards off. The crack split the afternoon like a rifle shot through cathedral silence. One horse spooked hard enough to nearly unseat its rider. 15 seconds, maybe. That's what it bought them. He urged the girl forward through dirt and dry grass until they both tumbled into the creek bed. By the time he'd dragged her inside a collapsed shack nearby, his lungs were registering serious complaints about his recent life choices. She turned to speak. Before she got a single word out, Elias Croft swayed sideways like a tall fence post meeting its final wind and dropped face first onto the rotted floorboards. Outside, hoofbeats drifted closer, and Nora Dalton understood, with a cold clarity that settled over her like a shroud, that the only man willing to pull her out of this nightmare might have just spent the very last of himself doing it. For a long, terrible moment, she was certain he was gone. Elias didn't move. The shack held the smell of dry rot and baked wood and old leather, the particular perfume of abandonment. Through the cracked boards, hoofbeats moved somewhere out in the grass, close enough to measure, not quite close enough to run from yet. Nora dropped beside him and rolled him carefully onto his back. Beneath the grime, his face had gone the color of old ash. She unhooked his canteen, soaked a cloth she found tangled near the wall, and pressed it against his forehead. "Stay here with me," she breathed. "Nothing." Then a cough tore out of him so violent it rattled the floorboards beneath them both. Nora nearly collapsed sideways with relief she hadn't known she was holding. One eye cracked open. Barely halfway. Do you always hover this close over strangers? He muttered. Only the ones reckless enough to fall down during a rescue, she said. Something at the corner of his mouth almost became a smile. Somehow that flicker of dry humor from a man half collapsed on a rotten floor made her trust him more completely than any speech could have managed. Elias pulled himself upright against the wall by degrees, breathing in short, deliberate pulls. Up close, Nora could read decades of frontier life written plainly across his face. Deep lines carved by wind and worry and seasons nobody had thanked him for. One shoulder riding lower than the other where some old break had healed crooked. Hands that had clearly fixed 10,000 things that nobody had ever thought to acknowledge. You should have left me out there, she said quietly. He shook his head once. No hesitation, no man worth anything. Walks past a wounded girl. Then his expression sharpened. Now tell me exactly. Who's riding after you and why? So she told him everything. Her father's ranch south of Laramie, sitting atop an underground spring that crossed the southern pasture. Water in Wyoming wasn't just valuable. It was the kind of thing men killed over without losing sleep. She told him about Sheriff's Deputy Cole Briggs, who'd been collecting quiet payments from cattle barons hungry to see the Dalton property erased from every map in the territory. And she told him about the small ledger tucked beneath the lining of her coat. Elias went very still at the mention of the ledger. That book contained names, dates, dollar amounts, and signed witness statements. Enough to end a career. Enough to end a man permanently. And if Deputy Briggs had realized it was missing, Nora's father wouldn't survive to see tomorrow's light. My father never took a thing that wasn't his in his life, Nora said. They know that. They just don't care. Elias believed her before she finished. He'd watched men like Briggs his entire adult life, shaking hands in church on Sunday mornings and quietly dismantling. Families by Wednesday for 30 years, running. He rubbed the edge of his jaw slowly. At his age, stepping into another person's trouble was an excellent way to never step out of it. He'd already done more than most men 30 years younger would have attempted. He had cattle to tend, a quiet porch waiting for him. Every sensible instinct he possessed pointed him toward home. Instead, he tilted his head toward the smeared little window and listened to the silence outside. Then he exhaled. We ride for Garnet Crossing before first light, he said. Nora frowned. The rail stop. Why? Telegraph office. He paused. I know a federal marshal up in Cheyenne who still remembers what the law is actually for. Elias had every intention of leaving before dawn. That was the rational plan. A man of 64 with protesting bones and a ranch that wouldn't run itself had no reasonable business riding through Wyoming darkness beside a wounded girl carrying evidence against a corrupt lawman. None at all. And yet, somewhere past midnight, that was precisely where he found himself. He kept the wagon well off the main southern road. Briggs almost certainly had riders watching every obvious route between Laramie and Garnet Crossing. Nora sat beside him in the thin moonlight, one hand pressed quietly against her injured leg. Working hard to keep the pain from showing on her, faced Elias noticed anyway. You're allowed to say it. Hurts, he told her. She gave him a look that could have sharpened a knife. You're allowed to admit. You're running on nothing. He almost laughed out loud. The fear riding between them eased slightly. Just enough for both of them to feel like human beings again, but neither let their guard slip far along. Near dawn, Elias spotted wood smoke curling above an abandoned stage relay station beside the trail. First glance suggested a lone traveler stopping for warmth. Then he noticed the horse tracks pressed fresh into the dirt beside the road. 3 riders, less than an hour old. He pulled the wagon behind a collapsed outbuilding and climbed down carefully. Both knees announced their presence. Lord above, Nora murmured. Does that happen every morning? Only before coffee, he said. She almost managed a real laugh. Then the hoofbeats came.